Well, everyone, I think that we've got enough people that have joined our February Zoom webinar so far. We've got about 80 that have signed up, and I think we're about halfway through and connecting to each and every one of you. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, appreciate all of you that are joining us today. I know last time we were together in late January, I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. I didn't have that light in my house last week. It was gone. I needed more light. And I'm sure each and every one of you have a personal story that could go on for hours about how we thought 2020 had left us. But for one reason or another, 2020 just wants to keep hanging around. And so we're just going to have to kick it and say it's time for spring. But wow, a 50-year ice storm. Would never have anticipated something like that. And I know that there are several people in the Oregon City and outlying areas that are still without power. And so we just, lift each and every one of you up for immediate resources from the National Guard and others to be able to provide you supplies, get you to your appointments, your medicines, food, whatever is necessary. Hopefully by the end of this week, everybody will have power. So with that being said, today we have a special guest, Tim Duy, who's an economics professor at the University of Oregon. He's also the senior director for the Oregon Economic Forum. He serves on the Governor's Advisory Council for Economic Development, and someone that I've had the pleasure of listening to in some of his other presentations at various groups. And he just brings a tremendous amount of current and insightful information on trends, statistics, where we've been, where we're at, but most importantly, where we're going. So with that being said, I'd like to turn today's Zoom webinar over to Tim. We will leave time for Q&A afterwards. So please feel free to go ahead and submit your questions into the Q&A box so that we can make sure that Tim gets all those. So again, welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to bring up my presentation here. So just give me 1 second as I get that set up. All right. Okay, so everybody should see my presentation, correct?
Yes.
Is that a yes? All right. So it's easier if I leave it up in this form than actually setting it up in locking up everybody's windows, I've found. All right, so I've been calling this after the fall, the pandemic recovery. So where are we headed going forward, given sort of what's been going on over the last year? And so, I think a quick review is just thinking about the kind of hole we fell into last year as the pandemic really started. We lost nationally roughly 20 million jobs, and we've only gained about half of those jobs back. So the initial stage of the recovery happened actually fairly quickly. And I think this gives us some hope that as we get through later in this year, we'll be actually able to accelerate quite quickly when we get more of the economy open. So we're going to be talking about that as we go on. What this looks like in Oregon compared to past recessions is obviously, quite a bit worse at this juncture. We haven't done anything like this before, at least in our recent history, where we kind of indiscriminately shut down a large portion of the economy last spring. And that indiscriminate shutdown really created a dynamic that is fairly unique in our economic history. And I would call it more of a supply side shock than a demand side shock. And that's going to be really, I think, important when we talk about how quickly the economy can recover once we bring the pandemic under control. But you can see that, in comparison to our past recessions, this has been clearly a bigger hit on job growth. I think we're probably going to recover quite a bit more quickly than, say, the 2007 or 1980 recessions here. Those seem to me bad examples from which to use for forecasting our next 2 years. I think we've got much better examples or much different dynamics than certainly the last recession we faced. So another interesting feature of this recession is that the low wage sectors really took a much bigger hit than the higher wage sectors in this pandemic. And that's really because of the disproportional impact of this pandemic on leisure and hospitality, and the extra, the higher proportion of low wage workers in that particular sector. So this has had a fairly, unexpected impact on state revenues. State revenue forecasts initially in the pandemic were for massive hits to spending, revenue over the next year or two, and beyond that. Those massive hits really never materialized. And the reason that they never materialized was the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on the workforce. Oregon has a very progressive tax structure. Obviously, if you by the nature of the progressive tax structure, if you put the people at the lower end out of work at this proportional level, then that doesn't have as big an impact on overall tax flow as if you had a much more disproportionate impact of the pandemic. So the state is actually faring quite a bit better than expected. In addition, there was lots of income support from the federal government, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that also held up incomes in the state and helped buoy state buoy state resources, tax collections, and also really keep the bottom on this economy together much more than we would have expected. Which really means that the worst expectations we had last spring never really materialized. There were people that were saying that this was going to be a depression, that this was going to go on forever. And I think we're going to find that all of those stories were really based on the assumption that this recovery was going to follow the same slow pattern of the last recovery. The problem is, though, this has been a different recession for a number of reasons, but one of which is that a policy response from Washington has been completely different. And to sort of see a story about that, what we do is look at income with and without current transfer payments. So this would include things like uninsurance tax rebates or unemployment insurance payments. And the bottom line is personal income excluding those payments. And you can see in the pandemic how much they took a hit early on in the pandemic as people's were laid off very, very aggressively. They've since come back. The goal of fiscal policy is generally to fill the hole, right? So in this case, filling the hole is that space. We fill the hole with way more. So it's my iPad skills here are not still up to par, but we filled the hole with way more spending power than we lost. And that's one of the factors that really kept the economy on a much more stable footing than you'd normally associate with a hit to employment like we had this year. An interesting feature, a result of that, is that spending patterns changed dramatically during the downturn. So this is a story about really, I don't know where that came from. This is a story about really a shift from services spending into goods spending. And you can see the goods trend here, which is the green line, and you would read that off of the x-axis here. Really, we're above trend on goods spending and still are. This data is a little bit dated now. We had a big retail sales report, for example, for January as some of the next round of fiscal stimulus came into play. So goods spending has been a big deal, whereas you could see the trend for services spending, we're way below that trend for services spending. And the story here is primarily leisure and hospitality, but also other services that require sort of close personal contact. So this could be, elective medical care. So this could be dental care, for example. It could be a massage therapist, right? Things along those lines where we really haven't seen the same kind of demand during the pandemic because people are worried about it. And then obviously, again, leisure and hospitality. So we've had this massive hit to services. Some of that spending was certainly pushed into goods spending. And so that's shown up in a lot of interesting places. So, for example, outdoor recreation, right? So, anything, dealing with camping, dealing with skiing, getting all those sort of typical outdoor activities has really been strong this past year as people tried to really shift their activities into what they thought deemed as more safer types of leisure time. So that's created, again, very interesting patterns because that's workers in those sectors and some of those good sectors have actually seen a lot of business and activity over the past year. I've talked to some firms that said they've had more business over the past year than they've ever had. So we've seen a very disproportional impact on the economy as a result of this particular downturn, and that's created some good things and then some bad things. And so for local municipalities that have traditionally had the role of serving or providing services for the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, those costs have increased as a result of the pandemic. The good news, though, is that revenue hits were not as severe as expected, both at the state and I think also at the local level too. And a big reason for that, and we're going to talk about that, is that another difference between this downturn and the last downturn is that housing markets have boomed in this recovery. So statewide, we're seeing a lot of the same patterns that we're seeing in the national data. When I look at the the index of economic indicators that I'm doing for the state, what I saw is a big drop early last year and then a steady recovery since that period of time. I would say that we're probably not in recession anymore, and I'll be updating the probability of recession. I get some new numbers from one of my colleagues. The recession here was probably pretty short, probably 2 months, a quarter. Where we actually had a downtrend in growth. Since that downtrend, we've actually had pretty strong growth. So I don't think the economy is technically in recession anymore. We haven't returned to our pre-appointment levels, for example. But that's not the definition of recession. Recession is a declining or contracting economic activity, and we're clearly in an expansionary phase at this point. I think a lot of our Oregon indicators are showing up, pretty much as we would expect. We looked at job growth earlier. Initial claims. We saw a massive spike in initial claims, and we saw a little spike this winter. So that really told me that a couple of things. First of all, the magnitude of the impact of the second set of shutdowns or business restrictions we had was much smaller than the first impact. And that's largely because the last round was much more targeted. If you remember past spring, we shut basically everything down. There was very indiscriminate hits to the economy. We did not do that this time around. And so we did not see the kind of impact on the economy that we did last spring. Also, these claims were very high, and I'm fairly suspicious, not just in Oregon, but everywhere. These claims, I think this initial set of initial claims made us overestimate the impact of the on the labor market. And so I think that there's a couple of things. The data collection systems were never made to go to deal with a surge of unemployment claims like this. So I think that some of these claims are double counted, and we have evidence from lots of parts of the county that there's a lot of fraud been going on in those claims. So, I don't know that it was actually quite as bad as those initial claims, and but certainly the second round has been nothing like the first. An important indicator is temporary service employment services payroll, which is temporary help. Those have been picking up steadily, not just in Oregon, but nationally as well. Those are typically workers we think of as first hired and first fired. So this is generally considered a leading indicator. And I think the consistent gains in that is telling you that there's fairly strong demand across a lot of sectors of the economy for labor. Hours worked in manufacturing has been a bit low and was in downturn prior to the recovery, or excuse me, the pandemic. Not entirely sure what's going on there. Some of the weakness there is certainly related to the inability of manufacturing firms maybe to staff fully given COVID-related restrictions. We know that national demand for manufacturing is picking up. Some of this was a sort of unusual hit to food manufacturing going into the pandemic. So I don't think that there's more than just the pandemic going on in that data. One thing I did talk about was the strength of the housing market. And we're seeing this in most of, I'd say, well, first of all, I'd say it's a national phenomenon, but Oregon phenomenon, and really related, affects most of the municipalities, if not all the municipalities in Oregon. Building permits are a little bit softer, but that's hiding a shift from multifamily to single family construction. There's been enormous demand for single family housing in this cycle that's been pushing up prices. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I don't know that I've talked to a city where in Oregon where this has not been an issue going forward, and expected to continue to be an issue going forward. An interesting aspect of this downturn is that in contrast to earlier downturns, it's really hit the bigger metro areas the hardest, and particularly the Portland MSA has really been hit the hardest. The rural counties less hard. Just a 6.5% decline in job growth in jobs relative to almost double that for the Portland area. Again, there's a lot of unusual impacts as a result of the pandemic hit. The Portland area is the most dependent on leisure and hospitality type activities between business travel and downtown, the downtown core work environment. Without people going into the downtown, that entire economic ecosystem doesn't work the same way. So, and this is not just an Oregon trend. We've seen major metro areas all struggle under the weight of the pandemic if workers are not coming into the downtown areas as much. The rural areas they're in some ways more dependent upon leisure and hospitality, but also in other ways less dependent on leisure and hospitality because they don't have, that central business district that's so dependent upon that daily travel. So work from home hits Portland more than it hits these other areas of the state. So that's been an interesting divergence in the data that's emerged over the past year. So, the story that I'm telling is one where we've had this historic hit to the economy, but you can see the potential for rapid recovery in both the first round of recovery early this summer as the initial set of restrictions were lifted and evolved, and then the limited hit this winter as a result of the winter wave of the pandemic. Also, I think you're seeing it in the strength of a lot of underlying indicators, such as income excluding transfer payments. So we're talking about that more. It's also dependent upon what activity you're in and where you are. But I'm fairly confident that a lot of the sectors that have been hit heavily can actually rebound quite quickly once we get the pandemic under control. And that looks more and more realistic here going forward. Okay, so I have kind of shifted some of my thinking to thinking about the economy in terms of reasons for optimism for this year. There's always a lot of pessimism I think, and has been persistent amount of pessimism for the last 6 months that we were never going to get out of this. And I actually think that that pessimism has really been misplaced, that there's pretty obvious signs that this was had a high potential for a rapid recovery from for several months now. So one thing that we've already seen is a V-shaped recovery in wages. So in 2020, or excuse me, 2007, 2019, once wages fell, it took, it took 2 years to recover to the old level of wages. This recovery has already recovered to the old level of wages. And that's, I think, an important signal about how much underlying strength there is to this economy. And the reason for that is that the labor market has consistently been stronger than it seems. And I look at, in particular, job openings and quit rates. Typically during a recession, you see a large decline in openings and a large decline in quit rates, and then a slow recovery. Right? These have been basically V-shaped type of dynamics. There's a lot of demand for labor underneath the surface of this recovery, and it actually spans a large portion of the sectors of the economy. What we're finding, I think, is some of the problems in the labor market is really related to, in many cases, a shortage of workers. A lot of people have dropped out of this labor market right now for a number of reasons, one of which, particularly if you're older, the 55 and above group has shied away from the labor market because they're worried about getting sick. And then if you are dealing with childcare issues, having closed schools and closed daycares is a very big impediment for working parents. So there's, I think, a lot of reasons why there's a shortage of labor in many sectors throughout the country, and that's, I think, what's holding up wages and salaries, is that there aren't quite a few jobs there that are still growing, and they tend to be better paying jobs again. So as a the issue is the weakness is still predominantly in lower paid industries. And so if you have growth in upper paid industries, it kind of compensates from it on an income basis. So I think that, again, what that's telling me is that once we can start to turn the page on the pandemic, and you bring in those workers that have been sidelined, and those jobs that have been sidelined, you'll start to see really an explosion in earnings and wage growth that will even further support economic demand going forward. So I'm fairly optimistic that by the end of this year, we'll start to see that process play out. Another factor is that the Federal Reserve has really gone to great lengths to promise that they will not tighten policy prematurely. This is very different than the last recovery. In the last recovery, the Federal Reserve kept signaling that they were going to tighten policy as soon as they could. Now they're signaling quite the opposite. They're going to delay tightening policy until they see actual evidence that inflation is at or sustainably at 2% for raising interest rates, or even for tapering some of their bond purchases. They want to see considerable progress made in the labor market. When the Fed thinks of considerable progress in the labor market, they're not just thinking the unemployment rate, but also bringing those workers back in the workforce that have been displaced by COVID. So that's a process that could take that could happen fairly quickly, and I'm optimistic that it could happen fairly quickly later this year. But that doesn't push off that pushes off tightening of monetary policy into 2022 for asset purchases and well beyond for interest rates. So the Federal Reserve, I think, is really a big support here for this economy going forward this year. That has helped maintain supportive financial conditions. Stock prices have been at record highs. Bond prices are rebounding. Oil prices are bouncing back. Inflation expectations have been are rising. It's actually quite remarkable, the difference again between this recovery and the last recovery, where it took years for stock prices to recover, and again, I think this really reflects that this is a very different nature of the different nature of this downturn compared to the last, and related to that. Uh, that the last downturn involved a lot more damage to the financial sector than we had this time. So we're able to rebound much more quickly in the financial sector, keep financial conditions accommodative. That will support the overall economy. So that's been good. Another issue, and we were talking about this beforehand, there's been a huge amount of what I call forced savings in the economy. This is the personal saving rate, which surged to nearly 35% this spring, as people with jobs, retained jobs, were simply unable to spend money because of the indiscriminate shutdowns, and it continues to remain high, also because of fiscal support. So, there's a lot of households that do receive rebate checks that don't have the capacity or that are to spend them right now. And so that bolsters the saving rate as well. My estimates for saving suggest that we could have going on upwards of close to $2 trillion now of excess saving that has built up over the downturn. So that has really helped household balance sheets. So this is another big difference between the last downturn and this downturn. The last downturn, falling housing prices in particular, helped really damage household balance sheets. This time we have rising housing prices coupled with rising saving rates, coupled with a rebound in stocks. All of that has supported household balance sheets more so than we've seen in the past. So that's I think another reason to be optimistic about going forward. That we look into later this year. Not only do we have more jobs, more income growth, more capacity and avenues to spend, but there'll be some pent up demand that can be covered by this saving. Another place, and I just mentioned this, but I want to show you again how widespread this is that household wealth, housing wealth has been rising very rapidly in Bend and Medford, but Eugene and Portland as well. You can see we're certainly rebounding to levels of household wealth that exceeded the last recovery. So this is owner-occupied home equity based on median debt and median home value. So also, these are really strong numbers for household wealth. I think over the next couple of years, you'll see some of this wealth tapped into from either home equity lines of credit or cash out refinancing. So there's another source of spending power outside of savings should we need it. Related to this is red hot housing markets, and I've already talked about this. The last downturn was marked by collapse in housing activity. This has been marked by an increase in housing activity. Again, this isn't a downturn that's really based upon the broad hit to aggregate demand like we saw in the last downturn. This is primarily a supply side event where it's not that my demand for leisure and hospitality has changed. My ability to find safe leisure and hospitality has changed. I'm just locked out of an industry that I'd like to be able to participate in right now. That's a very different kind of dynamic than what we went through in the last downturn. The hot housing market is I think something that is also particularly relevant for local finances, which are so dependent upon property taxes. And so, the kinds of dynamics we had last cycle just aren't playing out the same way. So local tax revenues, I think, have been stronger than maybe were anticipated at this time last year. A structural issue that I'm keeping an eye on that I think could be very much important over the next decade, this is maybe a longer run story, is cheap energy. We've seen wind and solar prices come down to being cheaper than other kinds of energy sources, and batteries becoming increasingly better and cheaper. This is probably going to create basically an energy revolution that really can't be stopped once these things are cheaper than the conventional production. That will become a sort of a runaway train for these industries. So that, I think, is an important factor that we should think about going forward. There's other reasons to think this could be a technologically, a surge in technology, technology-related productivity going forward. One of the interesting stories that's emerging that I don't know to what extent people have really internalized yet is the COVID vaccines based on this RNA technology have created proof of the value of that technology and its probable applicability to other types of disease, including cancers. So we could be on the verge of not just an energy revolution, but a medical care evolution. So I think that's a longer run story, but one we really should be paying attention to. One other factor too is the supportive demographics we have in this economy right now. And the chart for Oregon looks almost exactly like the U.S. chart. This is U.S. population by age, and you can see that this Gen X group here, right? This Gen X group here is what I call the demographic hole. As we moved off the boomers, this is a smaller generation in the background that's now in their peak earning years. But look, what's coming up is the millennials are moving into their peak earning years, and it's a bigger group of people every year. Then I think it's going to be an enormous amount of potential spending activity. This bulge here, that's the mid 20s to late 20s, that's driving your housing market dynamics right now. That's the group that's moving into their first homes and moving out of apartments. That's probably why the housing market's going to remain strong here for the next 4 or 5 years as that group transitions into their home buying years. So that was, I think, missed. I mean, early on, there's a lot of talk about how the housing market was going to collapse and we're going to have all these foreclosures. Right now, you shouldn't get foreclosed on your house. You should, if you're having trouble paying for it, you should sell it, and you probably have equity in it. You can walk away a winner. So the same kind of dynamics that you had in, again, 2007, 2006, just are not at play here. If you're having trouble on the mortgage, there's a good chance you can walk away, if you bought that house more than a couple of years ago, there's a good chance you can walk away with cash in your pocket, I think. So that's, I think, something to keep in mind. One other point is, this, I couldn't get the data quite as far back as I'd like to, but the red lines here are the population by age for 1994. And, this is this group here. That's your big 1947 boomer generation. But you notice that we were climbing up a hill in the 1980s as that boomer generation was entering into their prime earning years, the 90s, as that boomer year was entering into its prime earning years. And then that's the kind of same hill we're climbing with the millennials right now. So that was a fairly good economic period of time. Also, one that was highlighted by high levels of productivity. We could be entering into a very similar phase between, thinking about energy, thinking about medical technology, thinking about the population dynamics. That has a 1990 types of feel to it. So that would also, I think, be good news looking forward. So, when I look at the sort of near term economy, we are clearly weighed down by the COVID pandemic and the winter wave of the pandemic, which we knew was coming. That has been quickly dissipating. Now, we're still looking at how fast can we get vaccines out? What are the likelihood of new variants, and the efficacy of vaccines against those new variants. Along the ways, I kind of try to remind people that, again, that mRNA technology has looked very good, and probably can certainly be used to create booster shots for any new variants that come along. Also, they've also been remarkably effective at keeping people out of the hospital and out of serious illness. And to me, that's super important, maybe even more so than just preventing infection in the first place, preventing any signs of illness. We don't need to eliminate the COVID virus. We just need to make it manageable, and manageable means that it's not killing people or causing long COVID. And once you can get that point, you really have the basis for a general reopening of economic activity, and you can sort of see that in the future, even in the face of new variants. So I'm fairly optimistic that if we continue along the path that we're going, that we'll be able to, I think, be in a much more normal state for the economy by this fall or this winter. If not sooner. My instinct is that whether we should or not, the rapid decrease in COVID cases right now is going to intensify demands of reopening, and not just intensify demands of reopening. I think just change behavior, and that's going to be, I think, hard to stop after a year of restricting your behavior. A longer run trend that probably extends, sometime beyond the scope of the next decade. Oregon is now seen basically doesn't have a natural increase in population. Actually has a decrease in population right now, and sort of aggravated by the COVID pandemic. But there's been a continuation of a long-term trend where birth rates minus deaths are just slowing until we have actually negative internal growth. That means that we're much more dependent upon in-migration into the state to support growth going forward. And so that's just something to keep on our radar of things that might become more relevant in 10 years. So I kind of rattled through that. I've talked for about a half an hour, and it's probably about time to open this up for a little bit of discussion. And I can shut down my presentation or leave it up. I'll stop sharing it, and then of course I'll be requested to move back to a graph, but that's okay.
Well, that's great. That's great, Tim. I was taking notes as you were going through all your PowerPoint slides. There was just a wealth of information, and I'm glad that it was so current and updated to February 2021, so that we weren't looking at statistics that were 3 or 4 months old, but really seeing how the job market is so strong. I thought it was very important that you said, because of the fact that people are staying home for various reasons, the remote teaching of their children, that they've just not been able to get back into the workforce quite yet for a number of different reasons, that there's huge demand for labor right now, and that wages are back to where they were at the beginning. So that's a very positive indicators from what I can tell.
No, I think that's sort of underappreciated how many sectors really have been expanding employment during this period of time, particularly the last several months, even during the winter wave of the pandemic. And it's just a combination of demand. I mean, strong underlying demand for a lot of services, plus some firms just cannot get the workers in the door right now, and you see that You know where you see it is in some of the anecdotal information from the ISM Institute of Supply Management surveys. They do monthly surveys of their members, and getting maintaining workforce has been a persistent theme for several months. You also haven't seen wage growth for most industries decline as we anticipated. So typically, when you see a recession with a high unemployment like this, you see wage growth decline. In the measures that we have of sort of like for like workers, wage growth has softened a little bit, but nothing like we've seen in past recessions. And again, I think that speaks to the unequal nature of this recovery, is that if you're in a sector that's retained activity, you still have quite a bit of bargaining power.
Well, let's hope that V continues, as we saw on several of your charts and graphs. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Renata, who has a list of questions that have been submitted to the Business Alliance already. And again, I just want to remind everyone who's attending today's webinar, I see that we've got 4 questions in the Q&A that have been submitted so far. Please feel free to go ahead and send those in, and we'll do our best to make sure that they get forwarded on to Tim. Okay, Renata, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Kent. And thank you, Tim, for an outstanding presentation. We have some general economic questions first. One is, aside from the electricity price reduction, should we expect an increase in energy prices?
Well, in the near term, we're looking at, rebounding some commodities like oil prices, and that's going to drive up, the price of gasoline toward pre-pandemic levels. And I think you do have to expect that some of that's going to happen in the near term. I'm fairly optimistic that, again, we're entering into an age of cheap energy, but we're on the front end of that. And we're seeing a lot of commodity prices increase. We're seeing lumber prices at record highs. We're seeing copper prices increase. That whole complex has become more expensive. And I don't know how much of that is investors front running the recovery, but also there's issue of pent up, basically satisfying pent up demand. And then in some sectors, again, you've got the COVID related slowdowns in production. So you're seeing a lot of a tightness in a lot of sectors right now, and energy is going to be one of them.
Great, thank you. Another question, should we be concerned about an increase in inflation and any impact on the stock market?
So when we're thinking about inflation, what we're thinking about is a couple different spaces. So one space is what we call level effects. So last year, for example, there was declines in inflation and during the pandemic. And so those are very temporary declines. And so, when it's like the graph went like this, and now it's going to bounce back like this. So if I compare, March and April inflation to prices to last March and April, there's going to be a big bounce. We call those level effects, just basically compensating for the sharp decline a year ago. So that's level effects, and we don't really worry about those because that's kind of just a return to trend. So that's one thing that we're expecting to see in the next couple of months. Those should be largely one-off events. They're not really processes, sustainable processes of inflation. Then later in the year, as some of this activity comes back online, we should see some pressure points too, when there's a surge in demand for maybe leisure and hospitality in the short run, and some of that has been damaged. Although I think that there's probably less damage than we think there is. I think there's more firms, more restaurants are going to survive this than maybe we thought a year ago, for example. So, but that said, there should be some price pressures associated with that. Right? So all of that should be temporary stuff. So we're thinking about, are we going to get some kind of really stronger, sustainable inflationary process? And it has been hard to create those processes for the last 20, 25 years. We haven't been able to get enough heat in the economy to really create those sustainable inflationary processes. And so it's hard to, with any certainty, say, oh, this is the time, because we've said that 3 or 4 times in the last 20, 30 years, and it has never materialized. So I'm not terribly worried about getting that sustainably higher inflation. And also, I think it's an issue of sort of what kind of what kind of metrics are you thinking about here? The difference between 2 and 3% inflation, which maybe that's something that's possible, is very different than what we saw in the 1970s, for example. These are the kind of scale that we're talking about here, even with inflation, is so much lower than the worst fears. What we would be looking for, what I would be looking for if I thought that inflation were something evolving into something what I call interesting, really would be a sustained interaction between wage inflation and price inflation, so that you did have that dynamic where not only was prices going up 3 or 4% a year, but wages were going up 5 or 6% a year. So inflation plus productivity. That would suggest to me a much more sustainable process at a higher inflation rate than we've been comfortable with, and that could entail some sharper responses from the Federal Reserve to try to rein in that kind of inflation. So I'm certainly watchful of that. I'm not anticipating that. What we're seeing right now in financial markets is longer run interest rates have been rising. They've been rising because of general improvement in the economy and optimism for the economy, the same thing that's pulling up stock prices. So I'm not terribly worried that there's going to be some kind of inflation reset here in the near future. These dynamics are stickier than we have, I think, come to believe. We all somehow live in this fear of the 70s still, and that's something that we've never been able to recreate for decades now. And I don't think we have a good idea of exactly how to recreate that environment.
Great, thank you. How will the state be able to offset its current budget shortfall?
Well, it's going to do it. Well, first of all, I think there will be less of a budget shortfall than expected. I think the economy continues to outperform expectations. So I think future forecasts will be revised upward. So the first thing is it's not going to be as big of a hit as anticipated. The second issue, related issue, is we're probably going to get some federal spending, federal money for state and local governments. So I think that's something that will also come into play here over the next year. I think that'll come out of this next administration package. So that's relevant. So my guess is that those two will go a long way, and then spending cuts, I think, will make up whatever the difference is. If there's still some budget shortfall for the next biennium in particular, I'm personally one that doesn't see a lot of scope for large new taxes. Only in part because we came into this on the bat with a brand new tax. That should do fairly well in this environment, actually. And we'll see how the corporate activity tax plays out. We just don't have great data on that yet. But this should be the kind of environment that where those big sales from retailers or something actually held up better than expected. So I'm not seeing where it's great politics to try to push through a big tax hikes at this point.
Great. What do you think the COVID economic impact will force a come to Jesus revelation with respect to PERS benefits?
Well, I don't think. Yeah, I think those are pretty much locked in. The courts have already ruled on this time and time again, and I don't see where we're going to be changing that story. I think we're looking for the next 10 years to finally move the pig through the snake sort of thing. And I don't see where, that's gonna change. So, that's just, we've been talking about this purse thing and letting it hold up our lives for decades now. And, I just think we've got to stop using that as an excuse to, basically not do anything. I think that's essentially what the legislature decided when they moved through the corporate activities taxes. We can't spend another 20 years or even 10 years using that as an excuse for inaction.
Okay, turning now to questions around the housing crisis. You've touched on that a little bit in your presentation. One of the questions we received is, how have you seen, we've seen regulations at both municipal and state levels preventing developers and builders from filling the housing shortfall projected by Governor Brown's office in 2018 of 155,000 units. That was before the wildfire crisis. When you couple that with rising costs in nearly every city, and especially in rural areas, the median household income family cannot afford to buy the median priced new home. If you could wave a magic wand to implement 3 cures to the housing crisis, what would they be?
Yeah, this has been, an ongoing challenge, and it's very discouraging. You mentioned the 150,000, shortage that we announced. The governor's office declared a couple years ago, and I've become fairly cynical about this particular situation, that we don't have the willpower to really solve this problem, which is increasingly, I think, as you mentioned, a burden for so many households. What are your solutions? I don't know that any blue state, by the way, has really found some great solutions. Just so we're clear, again, this is not an Oregon specific problem. We see this, up and down the West Coast, for example. One of the issues here is that builders will build to the market. They will not deliberately overproduce and drive prices down, right? To the extent that that happened in 2007, 2005, that sort of era, that housing prices fell sharply, that was a mistake, right? Builders did something they're just not naturally inclined to do. So builders are building what the market demands. So if in fact they're building that prices, they keep getting sold. So I keep getting told no one can buy a house, but in fact, houses are being sold and they're being built at those prices. So there's clearly demand at that range that's driving this. So, I like to keep that in mind. So what we're trying to do is, can we produce housing at a substantially reduced cost that actually gets the builders to overproduce? And so what makes you do that? Well, one issue is land availability. Clearly, our urban growth boundaries, I think, are basically impossible to change in any kind of timely fashion. This has long been a complaint that has prevented, new land from coming to the system and keeping pad costs high. Just increasing the urban growth boundaries, though, is not by itself a solution, because then you have the cost of infrastructure. So if you insist on pushing that cost of infrastructure onto the developers, that's going to keep the cost of housing high, even if you expand urban growth boundaries. So do you have mechanisms to actually subsidize the infrastructure? So ways to bring down SDCs dramatically. That's going to, again, sort of induce builders to build more than they would otherwise at maybe lower prices than they would otherwise. So that's another thing that we should be, considering, I think, is nobody wants to do that, though. And I'll be, the idea is that you're giving a subsidy to the greedy builders. And, the desire is to give the subsidy to the demanders, the household side. And, the challenge is that, if you increase demand without increasing supply, what you're going to do is drive up housing prices more. So you've got to find a way. If you want to support the demand side, that's fine. You have to support the supply side in order to compensate for that. And the public sector and public sector restrictions on what can be deemed as affordable housing tend to raise the price of the ability of the public sector to build affordable housing. So it's much more expensive than the private sector cost. So, you know, you really got to do something to incentivize the subsidies, the builder side of it. So there's two issues, you know, A, increasing land availability, B, reducing infrastructure costs or absorbing the infrastructure costs internally. Three is allowing for more density within the urban growth bound area. Now, this is hard to do at this point, you know, and there's a lot of, you know, I think, you know, optimism that this is something to be achieved in a very rapid pace of time and or rapid fashion, and I'm less optimistic about that. But certainly, we need to start moving away from this idea that we're really restricting housing to single-family housing, and the state has done that with HB 2001 has sort of moved in that direction. My view is that municipal governments will try to prevent that from happening. They'll gum up the works wherever they can in order to prevent infill and higher density housing internally. There's strong opposition to that from existing neighborhoods. You know, my view is that's something that really needs to be done. It's not the magic bullet. You know, I think that, you know, some people will say, oh, well, we need these, a good example of that is accessory dwelling units, right? We just need to build more accessory dwelling units. Well, you know, I think that there's fewer homeowners that want to do that than you think. So these aren't real solutions in any short-term amount of time. But, you know, so increased density internally. At the same time, we have to sort of make more land available. We have to do something about bringing down infrastructure costs for builders. That seems to be what's on our plate. Outside of our control will be federal government support for massive increases in supply of housing. So I don't know that we necessarily should go back to the, you know, project housing of the past, but using federal dollars to subsidize the construction of housing, I think would be very important.
Sounds like a very heavy lift. Thank you for your
It
insights.
is. I was very frustrated in a meeting last week where, you know, or a couple of weeks ago, where, you know, the issue was that some economic development plans are being sort of pushed back upon. So one thing, you know, one aspect that's going on right now in some of our communities is, you know, if people can work from home, you know, we're having, you know, people from San Francisco more commonly work from home in Bend or Portland or Eugene. And so you can build your local economy as sort of a work from home, a Zoom town sort of economy. But then the pushback on that is, or anything related to that, or even bringing higher wage jobs into your community is, then what's that going to do with housing prices, right? And I get frustrated because most of our state and most of our municipal governments have already decided what they're going to do about housing prices, and that's nothing. So are we going to continue to let that be a barrier, or are we going to deal with it?
Great, thank you. A separate question. Portland Business Alliance survey recently showed that businesses are having a difficult time absorbing all of the new state and local taxes to improve the education funding system and to create a local clean energy program. What do you anticipate this year's legislative session to pass in the way of additional taxes, if any?
Well, that's the tough thing right now, is I know that there's this enormous, I don't know exactly what the state is going to try to push forward in this in this next legislative session. So I'm not going to speculate on that. I know that there's this constant tension between, you know, the increase in taxes and different kinds of taxes and, you know, how businesses are able to absorb it. I can only sort of say that this has been this constant issue for many years, and wherever I go, somebody complains about taxes. So, you know, we don't know when you kind of push these things over the limit, you know, before it becomes, you know, unwilling to participate. You know, one of the big issues cities are going to be facing is to what extent do they try to mimic the Portland area's efforts to deal with the homelessness issue, right? Because now we're tied here, right? You know, the business community says no new taxes, but do something about the homeless. Well, you know, how do we bring those things together? You know, becomes a real issue. And so, you know, the other thing too is if you talk about, you know, how are we going to get more infrastructure spending? Well, what's going to pay for that? You know, what? So there has to be some bigger discussion here about our objectives and our how we're going to fund those objectives if we want to sort of meet the goals of the business community. And I don't feel like we're fully having that discussion.
And you've touched on my next question, which deals with homelessness. Addressing the homelessness issue in our local region continues to be a top priority for people living in the area. Recently, Metro passed a bond measure providing millions of additional dollars to housing authorities to address the issue, but nothing seems to be moving forward. What economic impact do you see this having on the image of our region to businesses looking to possibly relocate here? Also, with new construction of affordable housing in severe decline, won't this just lead to more poverty and homelessness on our streets?
So, yeah, so there's like 10 questions there, really, right? Which is fine. So I always preface this story with, again, homelessness is not just an Oregon issue, right? It's a West Coast, if not national problem. So I don't like to say, you know, again, we're doing something deliberately, you know, dramatically different than other places. So a lot of places are facing this challenge. I do think that you know that the metro area is going to have a challenge here. Now they've basically gone and said we're going to take, you know, a large tax measure to fund this problem, to deal with this problem. They're going to have to actually come up with a solution to it. And I don't know if you could have expected a solution to that this week. You know, just, you know, so that's something that's going to have to take time. But you know, this is where, you know, it gets to your other issue about, you know, if firms are paying taxes and they see the results of that taxes they expect or want, then they're going to be more willing to absorb those costs than if they don't. So I think the metro area has really put themselves in a position here where they have to come up with solutions here. Now, what are they targeting? And this is going to be an interesting question. Is they targeting the visible unhoused, or are they targeting a different part of the market? How are they doing it with demand or supply? I don't know how this, I don't have enough knowledge about how they're planning to come out to resolve this. My concern is that, again, getting back to the issue of 150,000 units, the scale of what needs to be done is immense, and it has to come from the supply side. And I've heard people from the advocacy community said you can't build your way out of this. And well, then again, you have to build your way out of this. This is kind of the only way you can go forward. So, you know, I'm a little bit worried that people are going to be disappointed by the results of this if they're really concerned about, you know, the image of downtown. So, you know, I would be cautious until we actually see something happening on these fronts. And it's too early to expect any results, but I'm kind of worried that this is a space we're going to be in. I'm a big building advocate. You know, how do we incentivize the production of housing on a wide scale? I think that has to be where the solution lies, whether it's, and there's a lot of resistance to that. Unless it's, you know, a specific kind of housing, which is, you know, urban housing, you know, for nice urban apartments, you know, there's a lot of resistance to, you know, either densifying our neighborhoods, you know, more things like single residency units, SROs, things that could, theoretically change the discussion. But I know that this is a long-winded discussion that says we need to find ways to build more spaces more cheaply. Is the issue here. The regional issue, again, the parts of sort of Portland particularly affected are a fairly narrow segment of Portland. A lot of, again, it gets to a bigger question too of what does the future hold for large urban areas? To what extent does work from home go away? To what extent does it stay? What does it do to your downtown traffic, as far as walking traffic, people traffic? Do firms, if they don't have to do work from home, or if they're doing more work from home, do they locate to less central locations because their workers don't have to commute every day anyway, right? A lot of potential dynamics could go on that influence the direction of the downtown environments, that then get into this issue of sustainability of the kind of ecosystems we know about, and we're still working our way through those. So I don't, when I talk a story about in particular Portland, because that's where this discussion has been largely centered lately. The regions still maintains a lot of benefits, and we kind of have to remember that the negatives are highly concentrated. There's also another issue too in the background of, again, that millennial generation and them wanting single family housing, and that creating another internal dynamic where it's driving up the price of housing in the region, particularly at the single family level, maybe not so much apartment growth, but then that shifts where the builders are. The builders then will shift away from building apartments and towards single family homes. So that creates a different sort of issue for dealing with rents in the unhoused. So it's a big problem. It's a big issue that Oregon has not found a solution to, but neither has Washington or California, to my knowledge.
All right. Well, thank you. We now have some questions from our audience. First, a question from Rob Gage. He asks, can you comment on the argument there is a push-pull going on with the employers needing people who may be staying home because of the ongoing stimulus payments as a disincentive to return to work?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. We traditionally have not seen large impacts from that. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence that is supportive of that, that position. And I think if that is a problem, it's going to become really evident here in the next 6 months as activity comes back. There are definitely the problems that I've certainly focused on are the unwillingness to work as a result of, not the unwillingness to work, that's not the right way to say it, the unwillingness to participate in the labor force at this time because of health concerns or childcare issues. So I focused on that. There's a second issue that's been largely not discussed, and that's the unwillingness to work or because of substantial uninsurance payments and other government benefits. So that is going to be something that, it becomes evident in the next 6 months as demand really starts to ratchet up. And I don't know, and it should become evident in the form of rising wages, more aggressive wage increases to induce people to compensate for that. But I think it's certainly an issue I'm watching. It's a tough one right now because so many people have been displaced in some specific sectors that there's not as much job growth right yet. So leisure and hospitality, for example, right? If the number of restaurant jobs are just lower, you know, you kind of need that aid. And it's not really necessarily efficient to transfer into another industry if your industry is going to be back in 6 months. But that gets that issue, is there a pressure point, right? As the economy opens up, that's an inflationary pressure point, a temporary inflationary pressure point. And that's exactly one of those places where that can play in.
Okay. Our next question is from Victoria Meinig. What I'm hearing is the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Is there any reason to be optimistic about a growing middle class?
Oh, you know, so yeah, the optimism comes from kind of the slides that I showed you earlier. Is that I should sort of back off and how I think about this. If you want that kind of environment, a more broad-based, inclusive growth environment, you have to make the labor market really hot. And that's what we actually were starting to see that in 2018 and 2019. And because the pandemic came before we got the 2019 data, people kind of forgot what was going on in 2019 and how broad-based the recovery was starting to get. This is one reason the Federal Reserve has been so dead set against tightening policy and so set, into the mode of wanting to push for further fiscal stimulus, and not so much today, but in general. And it's to try to recreate that 2019 labor market, because that's the way in which you kind of really reinvigorate the middle class and the lower classes as well. So that's where your hope is. Your other hope is, the Biden child care tax credit proposal, could dramatically reduce child poverty. There are things that could be done if we want to, right? Honestly, if you thought your biggest problems were really healthcare and housing and education, college education, these aren't big problems in a sense that they're not things we couldn't do if we didn't want to. We just don't want to. Is kind of my view on it. Is we've got structures in this political structures that just have decided to prevent us from solving these problems.
And that is the perfect lead into a question by Robert Campbell. He asked, what impact does school loan debt have on future spending levels?
Yeah, so lots of interesting thoughts there, or ideas. So we know that, for example, student debt, high levels of student debt is associated with lower home ownership. So that's a place where that shows up. We also know that a lot of student loan debt's not being repaid. So if you forgive it, it won't create more spending power because it's not being repaid to start with. So that's a little interesting twist in this. I have said that, to the extent that we want to forgive student loan debt and that it would become a positive for the economy, we really need to do that in tandem with a plan to deal with the next generation of student loan debt, so that we really shouldn't be thinking of this as, okay, a one-time sort of giveaway to the millennial generation. We have to think about it as more holistically as sort of, what are we doing to solve this problem more generally? And that is, I think, where I always go with this discussion. I think it's fairly politically hard. It'll be interesting to see how Biden handles this. I don't think that he wants to be seen as giving away I don't think he wants to be seen as aggravating class divide by giving away the value of a sports car to college graduates without some kind of compensating benefit for the non-college portion of the economy. So I think that's a real political issue that needs to be dealt with by the administration. My economic issue is how do you resolve sort of the benefit of the student loan forgiveness program with what are we doing for the students now that are coming into the system. That we really have to add that into the solution too. Again, this is for me, and I don't know what you do about. I mean, there's a lot of people with high student loan debts that are lawyers and doctors and dentists and whatnot, and it's not clear that they're hurting. So you kind of have to, maybe $10,000 too low, maybe $50,000 too high, maybe there's some other number. I don't know. So these are all the issues that I'm thinking of. That you can sort of boost the economy and give it some boost if you do alleviate student loan payments and take that burden off. But what point do you do that cutoff, and why do you do it, and what do you do for subsequent generations, are all issues I think have to be addressed in the same vein. And then I think you definitely need to do something about the politics of it, because I don't think the politics are really great for Biden. It's kind of the my thinking along those lines. It gets back to the housing question too. Is we've spent one of the things that really we've spent the last 20, 30 years trying to incentivize the demand side by making it easy to get loans for college. In the 60s and 70s, the system incentivized the supply side by making sure higher education was adequately funded with the goal of reducing tuition costs. So, I'd rather, if we're going to give student loans, I'd say, okay, well, then we know what it costs, to subsidize higher education. So let's, then continue to subsidize higher education at the level that's necessary to prevent the, accumulation of these kind of student loan debts. And that's how you kind of start to resolve, these challenges.
Great. Now we have a question from David Green. He says, can you discuss any connections between high housing costs due to lack of supply and change in in-migration into Oregon?
Yeah, those are kind of the same thing. When you think about it, right? I don't know that we can differentiate the two, except, right? Natural increase in birth rates are declining and have been declining in time, and the increased growth is being compensated for by in-migration. So it's clear that in-migration is a factor in supporting housing demand, a substantial factor in supporting housing demand in Portland or in Oregon and Idaho and other places. And then that gets the issue then of how much the supply is coming to market to meet that demand, right? And so, if that demand is coming in at a higher price point, builders will build to that price point. I'm a big fan of saying, what are the incentives builders face, and how do we deal with those incentives, rather than saying, the builders are evil and they're trying to extract money. I just think it's not the right way to sort of do policy. The builders have a certain incentive. They're looking for their 10, 12% profit return. And they're going to do what they can to get that. They're going to build to the market that gives them that. And it's much easier to get that at the high end, the low end of the market. So, if you want them to build at the lower end of the market, you have to do something for them. We've already kind of talked about that. But yeah, lots of parts of the country right now, again, the Zoomtown thing is certainly driving up housing costs because supply is not adjusting quickly enough.
And we have time for one final question, and this is from John Lewis. While not a traditional economic indicator, the impact of COVID has been hard on traditional schools and education. Is there an economic indicator on the long-term impacts of the pause in this education? Will we see something similar to your 1994 to 2019 age comparison graph with a drop in level of school smarts in, say, 20 years from now?
I am guessing, my expectation is that this is going to be the source of innumerable economic PhD dissertations in the future. This exact question of what were the impacts of COVID-19 on this generation. And it won't be just schooling, it'll be all number of things because not all schools across the country have shut down. So you've created some natural experiments, essentially, of being able to compare groups of students over time. So this is going to be like, and I mean, we don't have to even wait 20 years. We're going to be within a couple of years. There's going to be a flood of research leveraging off of this event to get to that question. If we look at sort of past story or past literature, we would think that assuming this is not equal to other school years, and I don't think it is, we would expect that there'd be some, subsequent damage to educational attainment at certain ages, and that, with the expected impacts on negative wage growth, et cetera, for this group or generation. So that's certainly something we'll see it in, there'll be, at the college level, there's probably a drop off in people who are freshmen, and there's going to be a surge in people who are freshmen next year, right? So there's going to be a 1 year difference between those high school cohorts, and that will be something people will leverage on for research. So there's going to be lots of this stuff.
Great. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for a great presentation and very thought-provoking comments. With that, I'll turn it over to Kent to finish out our program.
I tell you, I was writing and writing and writing while Tim was going through all of his responses. I want to thank all of our attendees for submitting such very insightful questions. None of these situations that we're dealing with are one-offs or standalones. It seems like everything's intertwined in one way or the other. So there's no real simple solutions to just say, well, if we just do this, this will fix everything. That's not the way it's going to work. I think we've all experienced that now, that this is going to take a whole massive team effort working together in harmony as best as possible. I know in the political world that's challenging at best, but in harmony to try to find solutions that are equitable, achievable, and can be done cost efficiently. I want to thank you, Tim, for taking on all these questions. None of them were easy, and I know that you were being stretched a little bit to try to come up with the best comments that you possibly could. But obviously, this isn't your first rodeo, so you've had an opportunity to deal with these problems and challenges in the past. I know we still have a few questions left in the Q&A, and so we don't have time to get to those today, but what we'll try to do is send those to Tim so he can respond back to us and by email, and then we can send that out to our membership, what the question was and what Tim's response is to those questions. But again, I thank everybody that attended today. I think it was a very informative, a lot of great information. I'm encouraged, but on the other hand, I've been in land development for 35 years, and I know all about supply and demand. And right now, we are really hurting for land availability. And I agree with you 100% that House Bill 2001, which does away with single family zoning statewide and allows for, got to get a polling question off here, allows for duplexes, triplexes, and quads, are going to face fierce opposition by neighborhood associations and planning commissions and city councils who don't, well, we'll just hear a lot of complaints and issues from the neighborhood saying they don't want to see anything change. They like it the way it is, but we got to do something. Infrastructure is costing more and more, and every time you build more roads and extend more sewer, somebody's got to pay for that. So we've got to look at all the different solutions that are available. Hopefully we get there. I don't see any other options, so we just have to be patient. So thank you, Tim. Thank you, Renata. Behind the scenes, we have Sherry Imes, our administrative assistant, who was setting up all the polling questions during the webinar. I'll be interested to see the results of those. And I want to thank my board of directors for assisting us in putting on this webinar. Next month, we're going to have the Economic Development Manager for Oregon City, James Graham, plus some of his team that worked at Leland and Associates. They are completing a survey and citizen outreach on urban renewal, how that has been utilized in the past here in Oregon City, how it's being utilized in other jurisdictions and municipalities in the county, what have been the successes and what have been the failures. But it's definitely a tool you want to have in your toolbox. I did get an invitation from Lynn Peterson today. They're doing the State of the Region Zoom event Friday. I'm going to reach out to her to see if she would like to do a similar presentation at one of our upcoming forums. Some of you may have gotten the Oregon City News, but it says walking at Willamette Falls. Metro has come up with a new plan for the Riverwalk. That's a scaled back version, but at least it gives them something to move forward on. And so we'd like to get Metro's comments and updates on that. So with that being said, I think we've covered everything that we were hoping to do today. I'm going to review all my notes, and Tim, if you want to go take a nap, if you're exhausted, you have my permission. So hopefully everyone can join us again next month for the Urban Renewal webinar. Again, we always meet on the 4th Tuesday of every month at 11:30 sharp. So be safe. Let's hope we don't experience another ice storm. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you for attending.